Well, welcome back, everyone, to Two Pastors and a Mic. My name is Shannick,
And I'm Corey.
and we're so thankful that you're joining us today. Wherever you're listening from, we want you to know we appreciate you. We're thankful for you. If you would do us a favor and like this podcast episode, share this podcast episode, or leave a review, especially if you're on Apple Podcast. It helps get the word out. The more reviews, the more shares, the more likes, the more people have access to this podcast. So
we say that we've said that 191 episodes since this is episode 191. And some of y'all listen to us so faithfully and you've never shared it.
never.
What's up with that?
But we do appreciate that
What we do.
you are
We listen-
listening, because we can
do.
see you're listening.
All over the world. Seriously. It's been blowing up crazy. We had the most listens in a single day in the history of our podcast last Wednesday.
Yeah.
I don't know what that was about, but again, we appreciate all of you who are joining us.
Yeah, I don't know. It could have been in the title.
Who knows?
Not sure. It was a good
one.
episode last week.
It was one of my favorites, actually.
It was good.
I like that conversation. I actually had a couple other conversations with other people that then they asked so many more questions. And I was like, these questions are great. And I think you might be asking the right questions for the first time in your life, in your faith journey. And then they're like, what's the answer? I'm like, I'm not going to tell you. Like, this is important for you to
Yeah,
struggle with that.
It is. It
You know?
frustrates people
It
so
really
much,
does.
though. It really does.
Just tell me what to believe. No, we don't want to be those guys that tell you what to believe. This podcast is designed not just as another outlet for us to share some things that we wouldn't necessarily share on a Sunday morning, but also just to breed the conversation and the process to ask questions. Breed the conversation of, hey, do I really believe all, like right now, where I'm at? I'm rambling right now, but what I was trying to say is confirmation in your bias in your belief journey, is that like alive and active? So we really want to question some of the things that you believe.
Yeah, and I think we should be growing and maturing. And
Yeah.
so if our belief is the exact same as when we were, 10 years old, 20 years old, and now we're 40, without any change or growth in areas where we come to new understandings, then this podcast is for you.
Yeah.
Hopefully it'll help challenge you in some of those areas to really just stretch your belief and really grow your understanding
Yeah.
that the kingdom really is advancing, it's expanding, it's beautiful,
It's
and
within you.
we haven't even touched the depths of everything
Yeah.
that is related to God and the mysteries of God and the kingdom of God. And it's that beautiful, that big, that amazing. And but we
better
hope
than you think
we
it
hope
is.
we're helping in that
Yeah.
journey.
Jamie says a lot of people in the church haven't grown for 20 years. They've grown one time 20 times, or one year 20 times. And I love that thought perspective, because that was me. And to have to unlearn a lot of things that I learned growing up and then relearn. And so, hey, question of the week. It is, I've got a question that I don't know if you know the answer to, because it blew my mind. I didn't know this
I have
last
not
week.
been prefaced for this.
You haven't. But before that, I need to celebrate as a Detroit Lions fan our overtime victory this past weekend. I wore my Lions jersey to preach.
did.
Might have been the only preacher in America wearing a Lions jersey on Sunday. I've never been more excited for an NFL season, and we came back in overtime. I'm excited. So you should be excited for me, because you should know I'm a faithful human being, because I've been a Lions fan my whole life, and we have sucked for my 3 decades
Yeah.
plus.
Some incredible, memorable players
Dude,
throughout the last
We
few
ruined
decades.
Barry Sanders' career. We ruined Calvin
Yeah.
Johnson's career.
Dude,
We
those
traded
are two of the biggest names in the NFL
we
history.
traded our franchise quarterback for over a
Matt
decade,
Stafford.
and the year he gets the year he gets traded, he wins the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a lot to be excited about. Okay, did you know, or how do you think internet gets transferred worldwide?
How the internet gets transferred.
Like
What do you
how we
mean?
have, like how we can all access the internet from a global perspective, like people in Europe and America. Like how is Europe connected to America? Because we're connected.
Right.
Do you know how?
Well, so I don't know if it was you or not, but I am privy to this information. So I do know, because most people would say, oh, satellites
So did you, what I sent you that I know you couldn't watch?
on TikTok or something.
Did you figure out, did you know that before you watched that, or?
I haven't even watched it. I don't know if maybe I asked you about it and you told me. It's like, my mind is blown. And maybe our listeners, your mind will be blown. So Corey sent me this TikTok, and basically all of our internet sharing, how we do it worldwide, is very limited actually with the satellite technology. It's actually cables in the ocean connected
You need
worldwide.
if your mind is being blown, you need to look this up.
I haven't watched the video. I'm still.
It's not even just a video.
I'm still not sure about this.
You just need to look it up, and they will show you all of the underground cables.
Yeah, and I'm sure
where
I've
they're
seen this
wired
stuff,
to.
but I also would believe that satellites play more of a part than what you're alluding to.
Okay, I might have just been a dummy that fell for information on the internet that might not be true because I haven't fact checked it. But my mind was so blown. All of our European friends are listening not because of satellite, but because of wires underneath the ocean connecting our continents. Mind blown.
It's crazy. No matter what technology it is, it's crazy that we can have a FaceTime conversation live with someone on different continents,
dude,
right now.
One of my favorite things to do when we are in Europe, so we have several lights connected via an app. So I will just turn on and off our living room
back
lamp
at home
while I'm in the Netherlands, just randomly. And Julia will send me a text, stop.
That's hilarious.
That is wild.
It's like, hey, that's
that
me thinking about you, babe.
Or I'll jump on we have one camera in the living room. It's so that when I can see the kids get home from school. But when you're on it, there's a bright blue light. And when I know Julia's home with the kids and I'm away, sometimes I'll jump on it, and Zion sees it immediately, and he'll look up and be like, "Dad, Dad," and those are my favorite interactions.
Oh, that's awesome.
Okay, so episode 191, back into our series. I never said that. Looking at things Jesus never said. Really wrestling with some of the things that are regurgitated within Christian thought. I think today will be a good episode. I've been guilty of saying these. I no longer believe these things. But the main phrase that we're going to tackle today, even scripturally, and kind of hopefully challenge you as a Christian to maybe never say this, is that phrase that, God gives you or won't give you more than you can handle. Jesus never said, I won't give you more than you can handle. God the Father never said this. This is something that, in my opinion, should be completely removed, and we're going to give you the reason for why. But when we preached this sermon 2 years ago, it was actually my wife that preached this sermon. We could also call this by its sister phrase, everything happens for a reason. I actually remember my wife loves the Kardashians. She watches that trash television. And I remember coming in just a couple weeks ago to an episode she was watching, and one of the Kardashians was being interviewed on the show. And she's just like, well, everything happens for a reason. I immediately get triggered. I don't know why I do know why I get so triggered by that, because it's just a terrible belief, but millions of people watch that and they believe this. You hear this all the time on famous podcasts. People saying, well, everything happens for a reason. NFL players get injured. Oh, I'll come back stronger. Everything happens for a reason. And it's just not true. And I love that Julia preached on that topic, that God won't give you more than you can handle, which is a lie, and everything happens for a reason, because I think she's the most qualified out of anybody to talk on that subject, being an orphan for 15 plus years, and her life story, what she's dealt with growing up, the things she's had to overcome from her childhood traumas, and not being wanted, still dealing with some of that stuff today of like, she does have biological family in Ukraine, and like, what the heck, you know what I mean? And so I thought it was a really cool perspective hearing her share it. And we could rant for a long time on these two phrases, but we're going to unpack a little bit more for you today with scriptures and maybe even some more rants, because I'm feeling like ranting today.
Yeah, no, we will definitely have a few more rants. I have one. I'm going to save it based on something you already said about everything happens for a reason, but let's just jump into it. Let's give some context. So the first phrase that we mentioned, I won't give you more than you can handle, actually comes from a misinterpretation of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, that says, you won't be tempted beyond your ability. But these phrases, I won't give you more than you can handle, and everything happens for a reason, we are going to say that both of these phrases are toxic phrases.
They are.
And we use them to explain and justify suffering, or to bring reason to why we experience pain. And a lot of people use these phrases because we get in situations where maybe we don't know what to say.
So we say the worst thing ever.
We say things like this, thinking that it might bring comfort. But the problem is these phrases tend to lead to people blaming God.
Yeah, right.
God, why did you allow this? I'm going through this. I'm suffering. Maybe you're not good. And we also then believe that God controls everything. Another thing that God never said, which we'll actually address that in a couple of weeks. So we end up expressing all this anger towards God for things that he's actually not doing. And then we get a tarnished perspective of who God is because of it. That's the main reason I would say we really get triggered by these phrases now, because it ends up putting people in position to be angry and mad at God, or to think that God is a not caring, loving God.
Or that God is doing this. So I'm
Yeah.
going to rant with
Yeah.
you. But one more verse before we start these rants, 1 Corinthians 1, 8, 9. You can read into how people got this perspective. Paul teaching to the church in Corinth, he says, speaking of God, he will keep you firm to the end so that you will be blameless on the day of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was talking about something that was going to happen in their future, but this is our past tense. In verse 9, God is faithful, who has called you into fellowship with the Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And so when we read this text out of context, we wrongly interpret from these verses that it was God that caused the suffering or the pain that we experienced so that people would rely on him. And this is a common belief within the church, and it is not okay. Because just imagine this playing out in real life. If you were in a marriage and your wife was like, you have to stay with me or else that's abuse. You know what I mean? When we give these ultimatums, like if God is giving you pain or suffering so that you rely on him, that's an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
That's not coming from the Father. And this is
So
why
like
we have to
like Melanie
reevaluate
being
this.
like, Shannock, you're not great on patience. You need to learn patience. So I'm going to break your leg so that you're slow mobility for a while. We would call that crazy and abuse, like you said.
People even preach this from like the shepherd. It's actually a wrong interpretation of looking at ancient history, ancient Near East shepherds. They said that they would break the legs of the lambs to be carried. That's the shepherd would never break the lambs or the legs of the lamb. So that's just a manipulated emotional pull to try and get you to rely on God from an unhealthy way. Because Paul, even in this passage as he's preaching to the church in Corinth, he's not attributing the suffering from God, but rather he was forced to look to God because of the suffering. It's a different mindset. In fact, we say this a lot in our church that no, not everything happens for a reason, but through the art of discipline, you can find reason in everything that happens, but not everything happens for a reason. And last week we said, when we were talking about love the sinner love the sinner, hate the sin, De'Eric asked that question to make you contemplate that phrase. And he said, have we ever thought critically about how this statement is heard? I think the same thing applies here. Have we ever thought critically about how, everything happens for a reason, or, God won't give you more than you can handle? Like, are we critical about how that is heard? Because now that I'm in the counseling world, you can never say this to people that have experienced. Imagine saying that to someone that just buried their spouse or child.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Oh, everything happens for a reason. Your wife just died. And we all have examples of this. I've used this to quantify certain pain in my own life. I know you have too.
Yeah, because like growth can come from different things, but that's not why things happen. I know my son has went through already 2 knee surgeries at 16 years old. He's actually getting ready to have a third one, which is just absolutely crazy now 2 years later, still dealing with all the issues from it. And he even, like, we were sitting down talking about the surgery coming up and some different things, and he's even like, well, I know everything happens for a reason, and God must have done this for some reason. I'm going to, be stronger, be more resilient, be enduring, all these things. And that's why God allowed this to happen. I'm like, okay, let's hit the pause button on that. And I actually said what you just said, the phrase everything doesn't happen for a reason, but we can find reason in everything. And I want you to know, God is so good and he's such an amazing father. He didn't cause this to happen. You were playing sports, you had a freak accident, and the body just didn't handle it in that situation, and your ACL tore. And luckily we have doctors and other things, but God didn't cause this to happen so that you would learn some
patience,
learn something,
endurance.
Or he wanted to test you
to
see if you would still trust him afterward. Things like that. He doesn't do that. But can we find reason? Can you, all those things you mentioned, Isaac, having endurance, being resilient, being like stronger and more like focused on what's important, like all these things can
Yeah.
come out of this as you're going through the process of this pain. And the pain sucks, but yes, good things can come from it, but don't belittle the pain. Like, it's okay to sit in this. This is absolutely awful, and it's horrible, and this is not what God intended for you, I promise.
Yeah, it's not God's doing. I'll tell one more story though, because without saying names, again, in the counseling world, imagine saying this to someone who's experienced rape. Oh, everything happens for a reason. I'm sorry. And if rape is a part of your history and someone said that to you, I'm sorry. On behalf of the global church, I'm sorry. I remember a session with somebody who this was a part of their story. Well, why would God allow this? Or, maybe he was testing me or trying to show me something. No, that is all bullshit, if I can just say that. And through months, if actually a year of processing this traumatic experience with this individual, the Spirit showed up to her and revealed that he was grieving during the experience, kind of like a redemptive act toward it, instead of asking the questions of like, how could you allow it? Like, he was weeping with her. And it was such an emotional experience in this counseling session that it actually began the process of her healing journey towards it. And instead of downplaying the reality of what happened and her story, she now uses it as a testimony. Again, not because everything happens for a reason, so that she could be out there publicly telling people about their rape, because, 1 out of every 4 statistically women. So statistically speaking, in our church, there's a lot of women that have this as part of their story. Instead of being, oh, no, she found reason through the healing process to be able to confidently share, because she can now reach people. But it didn't happen for that reason.
Right.
And that's really, really important for us to shift, because again, we do blame God for a lot of things that he did not do and does not have a hand in.
No, you're right. And it actually grieves me too, thinking about like some of the pain that people go through and what I feel. And so if I feel that when I'm connected to people, or as a dad, when my kids are going through something, how much more does our Heavenly Father feel that, grieve that with us?
Yeah.
So I'm so thankful that you shared that. So I feel like we got to pause here and address something. Matter of fact, it was kind of a question that got brought up from last week's podcast, but a lot of what we go through in life, where it feels like maybe it's more than we can handle, sometimes and oftentimes is because of a choice we made, or possibly some sin that we're involved in. Now, last week, right, it was about identity, and we did get a question on, so what, there are no consequences, we are able to sin and do whatever we want? Well,
yeah, we shouldn't
they weren't
challenge
listening.
people. No, right?
Because there are consequences for sin in our life. We avoid sin because of love, love for people, not because of some fear of hell. Now, I do find it ironic that people assume that grace is a license to sin, or that people will even want to choose sin if they know they're going to forgiven. Why do people always go to that perspective? Because according to Titus 2, and I know Jamie actually just preached this just a few weeks ago in our church, but Titus 2, it's grace that empowers us and teaches us to say no to sin, and empower us to live a life that's contrary to anything that might be a detriment to the relationships and to our life. And so we definitely wanted to address that in this episode.
Because people are like, oh, you're giving people a license to sin. I know we actually unpacked that in episode 99, that you have permission to sin, which is a juicy episode. We quote Don Keathley, president, founder of Global Grace Seminary. He says, you will never know you are free from sin until you know you are free to sin. And the reason why that statement is so powerful, and what you just said is so powerful, is because you have to look at your motivation. Motivation matters. Even your son processing, like, to be motivated to find reason instead of blaming God. Oh, he's trying to teach me something. Your motivation in that matters, because the reason for why we abstain from sin, and the reason for why we love our neighbor is because we're motivated by love, not by this fear of hell or fear of these consequences. Our motivation is love. I don't go and sleep around on my wife because I can and she would forgive me. No, I don't sleep around on my wife because I love her. That's the motivation. Like, I choose her. When I said I do at the altar, what I really said is I don't to everyone else. And motivation in the faith journey around walking with Jesus is so important, because I was motivated to follow Jesus because I was scared to go to hell. Like, every week, oh, am I sure? Every night I would pray and try to remember all of my sins because I was terrified. Is this the night that I die in my sleep and go to hell because I had unconfessed sin in my life? This is why we're so passionate about this topic and about grace, because following the law and following religion like that type of religion is exhausting and detrimental to thriving in life. And so motivation for following Jesus does matter. Are we motivated by love or fear? Are we motivated by empowering people? And when people say, oh, you just wanted to go do whatever you want, how do you know what I want? And why is it always an assumption that if I know that I'm forgiven and I can live in this grace, why is it always like these three things, like sex, drugs, and alcohol, and I don't know what the other one is, probably those three: sex, drugs, rock and roll, that whole thing. Like, why do people assume that is a thriving lifestyle? Usually it's just sex. Why is that you just want to go and do all those things? My friends, go look at the church world. All of the known affairs and sexual abuses that is running rampant in the church. They're following law, and it's not helping. So why don't we move to a grace-based message? Because this is what actually empowers you to say no to sin. Again, I love that question. How do you know what I want? And why would you assume that I want sin? So 1 Corinthians 10:13, you are allowed to do all things, but not all things are good for us to do. 1 Corinthians 6:12, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. So you got to ask that question. Oh, right. Man, when I know who I am as a child, I actually have to ask the question, do I really want that? Sure. You want to go cheat on your wife? Everything is permissible, but it's not going to be beneficial, and you're going to lose the respect of a lot of people. So that's why you avoid sin, because you're motivated by love, not by this desire that you have let run rampant.
Right. No, it's so true. And I know that was one of our very first episodes. You Have Permission. And it's still one of our top 5 listened to episodes ever. And I think it's more than just that it's in the beginning of our podcast journey. I think people are really seeking out answers. What do you mean you have permission? What do you mean all things are permissible? But that's why we say here at Hill City, and part of my message is, yes, the grace-based message is so important, and the gospel of grace is important to understand, to preach, to have that be a guide in your life, but it has to be paired with the gospel of the kingdom, because the kingdom teaches us responsibility as sons and daughters and citizens of that kingdom. So then that's where the question comes, is this beneficial? Yeah. So, no, it's really good. So God is not the cause of pain, trauma, and suffering. As we said already, God grieves with us. And we know this because as we read through the gospel stories, we see Jesus rebuking the storm. And so if we believe God sent the storm, God the Father and God the Son would be at odds, and they would be a house divided.
Yeah.
God the Father's not going to send send a storm just for the Son to rebuke it.
Or any sickness or anything that Jesus does as miracles in his gospels.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
It doesn't make sense.
Right. And so as we look at God and who he really is, we can find all sorts of amazing passages that describe God correctly. But a few of the ones we want to focus on, first off, is Psalm 18:2. This is David, and he writes, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." And I love this because if God is our deliverer, he's not going to be sending us things that we need to deliver from, that we can only look to him to deliver us. And so
that's abuse. That's literally abuse.
Yeah. So I love that. He's my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and my horn of salvation, my stronghold. Yeah. And that's a correct picture of who God is.
Yeah. And in the Psalms, David has a lot of incorrect pictures of God. And he's got a lot of emotional highs and emotional lows on his journey through writing a lot of the Psalms. I actually really appreciate that because it shows his humanity. 2 Corinthians 1:3-5, Paul, again, speaking to the church in Corinth, he says, God is the Father of all mercy and comfort. He says, praise be to God the Father, our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, we also are so also our comfort abounds through Christ. This goes back to, again, not everything happens for a reason, but we can find reason in everything that happens because we're comforted by a God who did not send the things that we are struggling with.
Right.
Really important. And there's a plethora of other verses. Two of my favorite are found in John 16. First, in John 16:20, it says, very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. Like, that's a promise. You will experience pain. He says, you will grieve, but, I love this but, it's a big old but your grief will turn to joy. Like, that's a promise. And he continues and reiterates that promise in John 16:33, just 13 verses later. He says, I have told you all of these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. Another promise, comma, but, another big but take heart, for I have already overcome the world. And so we wanted to reiterate that following Jesus will not make your life easy.
You will have things that you cannot handle.
Yeah, exactly. But we have a rock or a strong tower or a refuge to run to, the God of peace, which, as he said, as Paul says in Philippians, like, the peace that surpasses all understanding is within you, church. It's within you. And so, yeah, it will provide you that peace that surpasses all understanding in the midst of a chaotic and painful and a world full of suffering that we all experience to different degrees, not to compare, but to find comfort in knowing that God is with us through it all. But he's not the cause, he's not the author of it.
Right. I love that. I love this episode. I love talking about this. I think it's important for us to have this conversation. And we really hope that you were encouraged with this episode, maybe to start with removing these phrases from your vocabulary. He won't give you more than you can handle. Everything happens for a reason. Let's begin to remove that from our vocabulary, to start being motivated, not by fear, but out of love. And it's ultimately starting from the place of knowing how much we're loved by him. And that's the way we live our life from that. And so that's why we close every episode with the same phrase each and every single week. It's the reason why we close our services at Hill City Church this way, because really our motivation does come from love, our love for others, but we love because we know we're first loved by him.
Unconditionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Unconditionally. And so we would love it if you would share this episode. If you haven't left a review, do that. Like, share, subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you. You can comment below. I know Corey reads all of them, tries to respond to most of those. So we appreciate the feedback. So thank you for joining us on this journey. But as we talked about this love today, and as we close this episode, we really want you to hear this in a new, fresh perspective today. You are loved, and there's nothing you can do about it.